What is up, guys, and welcome to episode number 6 of the Next Level Esports Podcast, the number one podcast about esports coaching and team development to help you and your team reach the next level by getting the people side of esports right. My name is Donny, and today I'm talking to one of the first people I met in esports, and that is Floris Escapist Buurman. In this episode, we will dive into the world of scouting and recruiting esports talents. Floris is the current owner of esports team Dynasty and also Everything Esports, where he and his team helps others to help understand esports, to find opportunities, and is an advocate for healthy gaming. And last but not least, is as well the owner of Gamers Hub to deliver broadcasting solutions. Always getting the highest potential and best performing rookies on your team is a dream come true for any esports organization and team. But how do you select the right talent? What are some indicators of a lot of potential, and what are the red flags when looking for talent? In this podcast, we will go over all of these questions and even more. I'm looking forward to all the insight Floris has for all of us. So how are you doing today, Floris?
Yeah, I'm actually quite good. I'm happy being here, and today was just like a normal day. Stand up, have some cereal, go to work, start working, and now we have this podcast. So actually quite good.
Yeah, great stuff. I really appreciate you sitting down with me because it has a bit of backstory. You and me, years back, you were one of the first people I got into contact with, and you opened up a network of people to learn more about esports. And throughout the years, I've seen you, and we keep in touch from time to time. And I also know that you helped a lot of other people along the way, and you're always there within esports to help others. So that's a good note for everyone that is listening. If you want help,
Yeah.
Floris is the guy. And now you are helping developing new young talent with your team Dynasty in the game League of Legends. So what did you come all about, and what is a bit of your backstory with developing talent and having an eye for it, and always giving the helping hand, basically?
Yes, I think that developing talent goes probably way back for me. When I was younger, I always liked playing games, and then eventually I started playing StarCraft 2.
Yeah.
Well, I got up until the point of Masters, which is not bad at all, but it's not good enough to actually compete on the highest level, and I want to win. I'm doing things to win. I don't like losing. I can accept losing if someone is better, but I just want to win. So
Right.
eventually I switched to League because, well, it's a team game and I like the team dynamic, and I didn't like the solo aspect of StarCraft 2. And when I played League, I eventually became Diamond 1, which isn't bad at all, but I had exactly the same issue. I needed to double my hours to become good enough to actually compete. And I was like, well, I play support, so I'm already a team captain, so why wouldn't I start coaching? And
Right.
that's mainly because I, well, disliked the part of myself where I was like, well, I'm not good enough, so I'm holding these guys back, which is, I think, something you should think about when you want to become a professional player. And at the same time, I noticed that some of these players could do probably way better. And
Right.
that's probably the start. And I think that's 6 or 7 years ago already. Um, and yeah, from there on, my journey began where I started with my first team. I called it Mindset Zero. And the concept is actually there's a banner in my corner
Mm.
where our first third place achievement, where we had the mindset like, well, we aren't better than our opponent, but our mindset is better.
Right.
So if they make one mistake, we will punish them. If we lose, we will still be a group of friends and we'll win the second game. And our mindset was really good. And I think this was something that I think is really important for players. Like, be there to develop yourself and develop your team. And then if we go to the scouting and selection part, there's also something that if you are a player or if you are a coach and you want to scout something, look for what their vision is, what they want to achieve. Why are they here? Are they here because they just like a game, or are
Mhm.
they here to actually accomplish something? And, well, I think that is something that I learned over the years and only got confirmed over time, that if someone has that kind of eagerness, that kind of mindset, then they will be able to achieve, well, sometimes really good things, sometimes good things, but still they will make progress which can help them for the rest of their lives, even outside of gaming.
Yeah, for sure. It is quite interesting what you just mentioned of the mental part and feeling right within a team environment and you trust each other. So, when we are looking for talent, most of the time I see people when they're looking for talent, the technical skill alone. But what I hear you say is, yes, that is also part because you cannot go without it, but that other aspect is also a thing. And I believe it is worth mentioning, at least from my perspective, that is not what many coaches or teams do to look at that other aspect, more the interpersonal aspect. So, what is in your eyes talent for you, basically?
Yeah, so
What is it?
if I could make my dream talented player, it would be a rookie of 13 or 14 years old, being 1K LP challenger. If we would refer to league or being the highest rank in whatever other game, because they don't really have the knowledge of competing, but they just see some things in the game and understand some like small interactions which they just do based on their feelings, their intuition. And then the most important thing is that they learn to describe their intuition. So if I
Mhm.
do something based on an intuition, it's good. But if I can't describe it, that means I can't work into it and I can't change it or make it better. And then it's because, well, there will be a team fight, for example. And what happens is, oh, why did you do this? And then he was like, well, it just felt good. And
Yeah.
then he gets a quadra and it feels good, right? And he saw the opening, but what was the trigger? Why did this trigger help? And if you know the trigger, then you know when he entered, for example, what the trigger was. And then I think that if we look at the perfect player, then you have to have a like a high mechanical basic, but then at the same time you have to be able to look at yourself and be able to think about what you really want in the game, outside of the game, how your daily life looks like. For example, do you go to sleep at 3 o'clock in the night, or do you go to sleep at 11 or 12 o'clock in the evening? Like, it's a major difference. Or what time do you stand up? What kind of food do you eat? How do you prep yourself on a match day? Do you actually have like other things you do on a match day in comparison to another match day? What's your perspective on this? And mainly when you have younger players, they have never thought about this, but you can just ask these kind of questions like, well, how do you think a match day for you would look like? And then if they start talking about, well, in the afternoon I start playing a game, then you see what kind of perspective they have for a match day. But the prep for a match day should actually start like the day before. You should eat either healthy or make sure that it doesn't backfire.
Mm.
And then start sleeping at the right time so you get in a certain kind of zone. And this is something that top sport has a lot as well, where you just want to simulate a certain, well, feeling during the day to become in a zone. And that doesn't mean you always get into the zone, but you make it as good as possible, that your focus during your competitive matches is as high as possible.
Yeah, for sure. I like that. So, how much of those things do you look out for when you're recruiting or scouting players? Do you ask those questions towards those players? Like, what do you do before a match or before you have your day of solo queue grind?
It
What
it,
are the things that you do? How far do you go
it,
with
it
those
completely
conversations?
depends. Like in the first call, like when we look at our selection procedure, right? Um, it's first, someone is interesting based on social media behavior, based on their skill, based on their solo queue level, and then we go into a call, and then, well, I just ask them some questions like, "Oh, what's your experience in team environment? What kind of person are you in a team environment? Are you a leader or a follower? How talkative are you? Do you like to give someone feedback or receive feedback, or are you more like this kind of person that sits at the side and just watches and learns from hearing input from other guys?" So then I have a certain kind of image of this player, and then I know, like, well, you will probably work in this kind of team, but you might not work in another kind of team.
Mm.
And then based on their reactions, you go either further into, well, what do you do for a match day? Someone already has some experience, then they'll probably go through their daily routine, and then you can can go on keep asking about what their prep for a match day is. But if we really look at rookies, right, who have no previous competitive experience, then I don't really include these kind of questions because it's so hard for them to actually answer. Because, talking to a
Mm.
coach to be allowed to do tryouts is something completely new for them as well. Because, if they had a coach, most of the times it's a coach who is new as well and has to
Yeah.
learn a lot as well. So he's also, or she is also, just doing it the best they can do. Um, but it isn't the level, and I'm not even like the level of the best coaches, right? There's still a major difference between me and them, but there's also a major difference between me and new coaches, which is normal. But then if a rookie comes from a no-name team or a mixed team, then that also is really hard and different for them. So it all depends on the kind of person I have in front of me. And the more
Right.
experience they have, the more I can go in depth and the more I also want to know. Because if you have experience and you might be a good fit for Dynasty, that means that you either made a wrong decision earlier by not joining the team that really fitted you. Like there has to be some backstory because we mainly look at new talent,
Mm.
and that means we want like other ERL players who can fit the team. But if a player, for example, is 21 or 22, you're probably too old, or you have to be the perfect fit for the team.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting takes that you mentioned there. So to summarize it a little bit, if players have more experience, you have more knowledge or more context to go deeper into them, how they behave in
Exactly,
former teams, etc. And if they
exactly.
are totally new, you take the type of context as well, and you ask different questions, or you understand it or profile it in a different way in some way.
Exactly, yeah. So really need to know like how do they fit in a team, and that's also like sports teams, for example, or in a class, or what's their
Mm,
behavior at home, or what is the parent perspective on gaming and esports. Because if you are already playing for 3 years, then probably your parents accepted you playing a game. Uh, but if you're really new, then that means that they probably got no clue what you're doing behind your desk. So you still need to include these kind of questions. And then
yeah.
also like, okay, what kind of study are you doing? And this also shows what kind of interest the player has. So if you're doing a really technical study, that probably means that you have other talents than if you're doing more like a language oriented focus
Mm,
during your study. So there are so many small things you can interact on. And the first goal is for me all about getting the touch of what kind of person it is and what they want to achieve. I think that's the
mm,
most important thing. If you don't have any ambition, if you don't know what you want to achieve, I probably can't help you at this moment because you need to know what you want to aim for. If I ask you, if you would be able to join an LEC team at this moment, would you do it? And if you're like, well, I don't think so, I should first start studying, then it's probably a no go. But if you say, like, well, I don't think I can because I'm still at middle school or high school or what it's called at at your country,
mm,
then it's not a restriction, but you want to. You have this eagerness, and you know that, okay, if I can prep this player to be the best version of himself in over a year, then he or she will go to the LEC
mm.
or Overwatch League or
At least has the
whatever.
intention to go there
That's
and
the
to do what
intention,
is
exactly.
necessary
Exactly.
to walk that path.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that that's really important. And then from there on, right, then we know like which players fit. And sometimes you still go on with a player whilst are really doubting the player, but you want to see how they will work in a team environment. But this first call takes an hour, for example, and still that isn't enough. I think
Mm,
we still can do lots more and give them other tests as well, similar to what LEC teams or Overwatch League teams do. They have like different harder tests to let players complete before they actually can do it right. Well, that's harder in especially minor ERLs like the Dutch league or Belgian league because you just don't have these kind of resources. But I think it should be really good because the more you know from a player before you start working with him, the better, uh, well, results probably, and also the more certainty that it will work out the way that you expected it to be.
yeah. You can build more connection, basically,
Yeah, for
as
sure.
well. So what you just mentioned It sounds to me that there are sort of categories of players. Like you have the quiet one, the leadership type, or different. What kind of categories do you place them in? Even though it's not a nice thing, but we as humans always categorize everything. That's how we need to understand the world, right?
Yeah,
This chair, but behind me there's also a chair, but they totally look different. But we
yeah,
have to
exactly.
categorize to make sense of the direction what we're going for. So, what kind of categories can other coaches as well look for? What you just mentioned, but
Yeah, so
what are
I
the
always
things?
like the clown. I think the clown's really epic, and it sounds like a
Ah,
big joke, right? But I think the
no, I
clown,
understand.
to have one clown in your team is perfect. It's someone who makes good jokes, bad jokes, but it's always a little bit laughter. And also, these kind of people are really good in turning something bad in something medium, and then it's for the coach to make this something medium to something productive. But they help you as a coach to explain the rest to the other players who might be a little bit sad after a loss. So you don't really have to do everything yourself. And that's really
Uh,
important because you are the coach, but at the same time, you're one of them and you are a team. It's not they lost, it's always we lost. And if you think they lost, then either
mm,
stop coaching or start learning yourself that it's we. It's always a team. And so one aspect is the clown, one is the leader, can be the clown, but I wouldn't advise the clown to also be the leader because then they probably don't always trust him.
yeah.
Um, so the leader is also someone who says like, well, when are we going to scrim again? Or I think this is going wrong, or going to talk to someone who he feels like doesn't really work at this player or there's something wrong, because sometimes a player just doesn't want to talk to a coach or even a mental coach, but wants to talk to a teammate. So this is more like the captain. um, and then I
Exactly.
always want one person who always wants to give his opinion. I really like this. I don't really know how to describe it, but it's someone who is quite unfiltered. Can be the clown, but
Mm.
it is someone who just says what he thinks.
Is that the
And
leadership role, or are we
it's
talking
not a
about a
leadership,
different
it's
role?
like a separate role.
Yeah, yeah,
So
separate role. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
exactly, because the leader is like a bit more,
The
well,
criticaster, baby. They always give
exactly.
it a give
Yeah,
it. Yeah, okay.
and like this person who gives tons of feedback and says what he thinks gives you some room to talk about lots of things that you normally wouldn't discuss, because they just ask things that everybody is like, well, why are you asking this? You can't really ask this. But for me, you can ask anything. And if I don't want to answer, I just say, like, well, I'm not going to answer this question. But it's still really good that you ask the question, because it means that you feel free. And then I probably want two or three players who just fit the atmosphere. And these are the more, well, patient players or maybe more strategical players, um, who just want to learn and listen. And something that, well, became clear to me over the years is that these kind of players are maybe a little bit patient at the start of a journey, but eventually they become really talkative, and then they
Mm.
become another person as well, and then sometimes it even, well, becomes a second clown, and that might become a problem. And then you really have to notice this, because clowns can have a conflict, and you don't really want clowns to be mad at each other. So
No, my joke is more funnier.
exactly, and that can disturb the balance in your team, which is interesting as well.
Yeah, interesting take. And with patient, do you mean more quiet players? Is that
Yeah,
this?
but
Is that the
like,
same? But it maybe has a negative tone to it, but also for the audience to understand, like, oh, that's the instantly the thing that I'm thinking about. So that's why I
yeah,
mention
so
it.
yeah, I think it's probably more quiet, and like not the negative aspect of quiet, but more like something
Observing.
exactly more observing. I think that's a good one. Where you're really, well, just looking what's going to happen. You're still really eager to improve, right? All the players are eager to improve. If they aren't eager to improve, they
Yeah.
shouldn't be your player, at least not in my team. So that means that you need some players who are just chill, and will probably DM you with a question, but they wouldn't really question something in the group. Or maybe if you push them a little bit and poke them a little bit, they will answer, and that's completely fine. But you don't need 5 players who are always talking and always discussing, because that will really, well, make everything tough. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, these are aspects that we include in selecting the right players for our team. And then if we go to a tryout, and I think that's interesting as well, you have some teams who have like internal tryouts. So that you have like players tryout against 5 other players in the
Yeah.
tryout. Something I really, 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 really dislike. And the reason is that you won't play as you normally do against a direct opponent, because you're like, well, if I am going to smash this other player, then they will
I'm better
definitely
than
choose for
him.
me. Then I'm better than him, and they will choose for me, which means you're going to do more flippy things. And that might result into a bad conclusion. At the same time, most of the teams don't have 2 coaches who are exactly the same level, which means that the drafting on one side will always be worse than the other side. At the same time, you can't really analyze it on the same level, which makes it more tough as well. So I always prefer to just scrim against other teams, just play the games, and then during the games, well, we always have the review, and ask them like, well, how did it go for you? And
Mm.
really get insight into what they liked and what they didn't like, and what they want to change the team dynamic. It's not about improving, but it's about how we are working together as a unit. And then after the scrim set, we want short, like, well, 10 minutes, 15 minutes feedback sessions one on one, where I just ask them like, well, what was your global impression? What did you think about your own performance? And that's always a really interesting one, because they say like, well, it was horrible, or well, I played actually really good. But when they say, well, I played actually really good, then most of the times they played medium good, but
Mm.
they aren't self-critic enough. And I don't say like, you shouldn't say I played really good when you have the feeling you played really good. But it still gives me an indicator of how they look at themselves. And some players who played quite good and they're really good, they say like, well, I played horrible. I could have done this, this, and this, and this better. And then that doesn't really mean that that mindset is better, because being too negative to yourself is also a bad thing, but it shows some self-criticism, some learning curve. And if they can really describe good what they did wrong and why they did it wrong, then you can help them improve on these points, which also makes it easier to improve them as a player. So they have a clear view on their limitations, and that's something that I think is really interesting for new players or good players or rookies. um, so yeah, that's something that we then do. And then after speaking to all these players, we decide like, well, do we want to, depends, right? If we have 2 core players, for example, and 3 tryouts, then we of course discuss this with the players we already have, because it has to fit them. If it's like a
Mm.
full new lineup, then it's more focused on, well, do we want to continue with this player, yes or no? Do we want an extra conversation where we can have multiple questions? Did they answer the questions we told them to answer after our first interview? Because sometimes you just send them some more questions, or they have
Mm.
to search something for you, or give you more insights as well. And then based on that, you can give them a kind of points. Well, we don't really give them points, but in your head, you give them points, right? You say like, well, that's a plus for this, and that's a minus for that. And then based on that, we know like, oh, do we want to continue with this player, yes or no? And we're not going to waste your time. Like, if you weren't good enough, then after one scrim or tryout, you weren't good enough. And if it's a bad impression for that game, or you inted, well, if your mindset was good and you didn't play really, really, really bad, then you probably got a second chance. So you can't really say with it like, well, I only got
Right.
one chance, because it's like performance is only a part. It's probably 30 to 50%. But
Yeah.
your what you're doing and how you are doing it, and how you are speaking to your team, and your tone of voice, and like if you do like during a game,
Right.
that's like a big minus. It's really
Yeah.
negative and so tilting for your teammates. Or if you're like, why did you do that? Why? And then if someone like, oh, let's discuss this after the game. No, I think it's useful to discuss now. And then you start this friction, and it shows so
Yeah.
much about a player. So these are things during your first tryout which are so important for us to include, and I think should be important for everybody.
Yeah, I would like to add a thing to that that could be interesting. So there was research done of first impressions, because people say like, oh, you need 10 games to get the full scope of my ability and blah blah blah, how can it behave, and they are so
Yeah,
pumped up and they feel so good. But in the moment, even though it's uh well, in that moment you look at it objectively, it's just a situation, how it is, right, how they behave in that moment, and they say like, yeah, I didn't have my day or whatever. The research said if you meet someone, you have a really high chance to put them in the right category of how they are, even though we not really fully understand how that works in our brain, but we have these spider senses, and the first impression matters a lot. And the same thing goes for when they did a research, and I think this kind of correlates to this. It's the same thing about if they went to someone's place, they can predict the behavior by just looking at the room or their bedroom or how their house is structured. It's just an instant objective look at first sight, and in 5 minutes they know more about you than you would after talking with them for 10 hours or doing interviews, etc., etc. First impressions is everything. If you mess up, and I totally agree with you, it's really up to you, and you might not be ready. Maybe there's a small percentage that's just really bad luck, but hey, compared to everything, to be effective in recruiting and scouting, I believe that's a big thing what you just mentioned.
yeah, exactly. And I think the really interesting thing is also like, well, what if I played utterly garbage, right?
Yeah,
Still, then how do I look at playing utterly garbage? Do I
exactly.
say like, well, I played really horrible, and then I'm
Yeah.
like, well, what do you think you could have done better? And then I don't really want to talk
Yeah.
about the second game,
Just
man.
not int.
It
Just
was
not
so
int.
bad. It was just in, and then it shows no reflection at all. Whilst if you played really poorly and you're like, well, if we look at league, well, it was like my jungle tracking was really bad, or my communication wasn't good, and then okay, what wasn't good in your jungle tracking, what wasn't good in your communication? As long as they are able to answer it, it shows a certain insight and also a certain goal for probably another game. And if they then have another day, they probably know what to do. And in the second tryout for us, it's mainly like, well, can they improve on what they failed before? And can
Mm.
they make these small changes? Because the first tryout, you're nervous probably. And you're really curious, right? And you're playing with four randoms who you probably never spoke to. So yeah, I think these are really interesting things, and just something that popped up in my mind. So I'm going a little bit back.
Yeah.
Is before the first scrim, and I think this is really important. I always use like an icebreaker. Everybody uses icebreakers, right? But I always ask something that sounds a little bit crazy. So, what was your longest travel, for example? And then they say like, well, I'm Floris Buurman. I'm 26 years old, and my longest travel was to China. Um, and then someone else says like, oh, cool, I went to China as well. Where did you go to? And then you have this little click, right? This
Mm.
this little interaction. Or if you say like, well, what's your favorite cookie? And then someone says like, well, I don't really like cookies, I only ate fruit. And then someone says like, what, how can you eat no cookies? Cookies are perfect. And
Yeah.
that shows some interaction, and that one increases the atmosphere, and at the same time it shows like some interest in other players as well. And I think that's a good thing to have in your team or for your players. If players are interested in each other, then that shows that they can probably become a really good team. And I think that one of the things that we at Dynasty really achieved, and I think that our previous roster in Spring Split, like I quote Fat Shield, he said like, well, I don't think I will ever get a team that was so nice as this once again in my career. And I completely hope he will, right?
Mm.
But these words really show what we want a team to be. it is a team and it's not 5 players, or it's a 3-player team and 2 randoms. No, it's a team with 5 players and the staff, and you're like one unit and you completely trust each other
Right.
and want to achieve more. And I think even adding this small interaction at the start of a tryout results into something like this.
But it just to make it from a viewed from a different perspective, so things maybe click in a different direction. So having the icebreaker is super powerful, and what I see in there is by putting an icebreaker into the group, you release a bit of tension. Like everyone is there, it's a bit of distraction opening up. And because everyone doesn't know really what to expect of themselves or the teammates, they are. I believe everyone is tense in that moment. Even though you are the toughest person, you feel a little bit of tension. Like that's natural. That's
Exactly, and
normal.
it's good as well, right?
Yeah, very good. And by doing this icebreaker, like a crazy question, what you said, I believe it's perfect to release a bit of the pressure to open the potential, like open the floodgates to let everything go. Like, oh, I feel at ease, and then they can perform to really show who they are. And if they then fall off, then you basically done everything in your power as an organization or as a coach to for them to express their uh, being as a player, and then you can make the right decision instead of, oh, I was super tense, you didn't saw me. You take that excuse away and you open the gates for potential.
Exactly, and it's also like something. Well, after first game, we always say like 3 minute break, and you have to go walk or go pee or get some water or
How
just
many
walk
minutes?
circles.
20?
3 minutes
Oh,
after
three
a game.
minutes Yeah, yeah,
And then
right.
you just have to walk circles in your room. I don't really care as long as you're away from your desk. But after these 3 minutes, I sometimes wait a little bit longer. So I'm still muted in the room and you just listen. Are they going to speak to each other? Or are they
Yeah,
muted? What kind of interaction? What are they going to talk about?
exactly.
And this is something like it's a little bit sneaky, but it's interesting because then you get insight into what they like or what they are going to speak about. Are they going to look at the game or are they going to discuss something else? And it also shows like if they aren't going to speak to each other and they wait for you, that still means there's a lot of tension and you have to adjust probably your approach to the second game to relieve the tension a little bit. But if they start speaking to each other, that means that the icebreaker at the previous before the first game really worked. So and I like these icebreakers to be crazy. Like, well, what's your what's the smallest animal you ever pet, for
Mm,
example? Like, just say something crazy, and then they're like, what is this kind of
yeah,
question? And they start laughing. If someone laughs, that means that they relieve a little bit
yeah,
of pressure. So
for
I
sure.
think that's a little trick that probably can help.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So with you mentioned on a couple of things to look out for, and also a couple of red flags. I believe if you want to be effective, you have to know what kind is your checklist of do's, but also a not to do list. What is that other side? What is that not to do list as a player? What are the red flags? You mentioned already not being reflective on self or self critical. That is one thing. What are some
Yeah,
other red flags? Because that
being
could be a
being
good
late,
thing. All right, being late.
If you're not on time as a player or even as a coach, you're like this mirror for the players. And if you aren't on time, they won't be on time as well. Because they're like, well, you are too late, so why shouldn't I be on time? I can always be late. And then I think being late is so annoying because if one player is 10 minutes late and you have like 4 players, 2 staff, that
Yeah,
means
one
six.
hour.
It's
One
one
hour
hour.
is
It's one
boom
hour, one
wasted.
player wasted. And then I just for the joke say like, well, what if I get paid 100 euros an hour? That means you just burned 100 euros.
Yeah,
So like this, you
yeah.
burn it,
Boom, gone.
it's gone. So then they look at it, and if you then are like, well, it's not important that I'm on time, then okay, get out, goodbye. So being on time, self-reflective. At the same time, it's probably being able to be negative and positive. And I think that's really tough but
There's a
you
red
have
flag, or like that you need to have the to-do list. Like you need to
yeah.
be
So
both.
that's part of the to-do list, but I think
Yeah.
it goes to the other side. Like the red flag thing is that if you are too negative and you can't focus on the positive things. So if you're like, well, this game was completely garbage, whilst you were 10k behind, and then eventually you were 8k behind, then that means you did one really good thing, right? So
Hmm.
you still have to be able to point out these good things, because if you can't, that means that you get in like a negative loop for yourself. And it also means like during the game, you probably won't be able to get out of this negative loop. But when you did something good, you should be like, wow, good job, guys, we did it, and let's do this again. And
Hmm.
then you start realizing the thing you can do to actually get back into a game. And that's, I think, the hardest part for players is, what if I'm behind? What if I am in a bad state? How can I actually get back to win? Especially for rookies who have no competitive experience, is really tough. So the red flag thing is really like, don't be only positive, don't be only negative. Look for a good mix and be
Hmm.
able to be sometimes positive. Um, Other red flag, probably like it's not that big of a red flag currently at Dynasty, but it will be, is if you aren't going to use your webcam, that might become a major issue.
It
Um,
might.
it might. Well, like for the
It
players currently at
might. Listen, if
for the
you're
players
watching this
currently
play,
at
it
Dynasty.
might be an issue.
Exactly, because well, I still think there are some players who have their reasons for not wanting to use a webcam.
Yeah.
And I think that at the start, when you first start playing, you are maybe a little bit, well, insecure, might be.
Yeah.
But then still, if you're speaking one on one with me, you should be able to use your webcam, because you need to build an identity. Esports is not only about, well, being a
Yeah.
mechanical good
Me and
player.
my game.
Exactly, it's like you have the mental aspect, where we spoke about lots and lots already, but it's also your online identity. It's like, how do you behave on social media? How do you behave on Twitch? What kind of accounts do you have? How many followers do you have? What kind of interaction do you do in League of Legends? Or what kind of interaction do you do in a game like CSGO or StarCraft 2? Like, what kind of personal identity do you have? Do you tweet after a loss? Do you tweet after a win? Are you able to do interviews? Are you willing to do
Hmm.
content creation? Like, if you are not, you will probably hate a professional life. You
Yeah.
will probably
You're
don't like
looking
it at
for the
all.
holistic, the full package. That's what I hear.
Exactly, and like I think, and that's why we aren't doing it currently, because, well, we aren't paying our players, so that means that you can't really cherry pick and make the perfect bunch. But at the same time, I think that if you want players to, well, become an LEC player, or become a CSGO EM player, or a Blast Pro Series player, then you have to be able to stand before a camera, and you
Hmm.
have to be able to do an interview, and you will have fans who want to interact with you, who, well, probably will flame you after you
Hmm.
lost.
Yeah.
And there is a reason that in sports, like, I have a little nephew, I think he's 4 or 5 years old, and he's like in the, or probably 1 or 2 years older already, because it's a while ago that I heard this story. But and he already got like a camera on his face at 5 or at 4 years old, just to speak to a camera, not like a real interview, but just like get a
Yeah.
feel. And it's part of esports, because esports is an entertainment industry as well. um, so yeah, I think that for players, currently it's not like a major red flag, but in the future it will probably be. And yes, there are teams who have like 3 players who really like to be in front of camera, but still, if you're in a gaming house, like the CLG video that popped up where they fired their players,
Yeah.
well, it's quite meme, but I think that having someone film you during these kind of meetings will probably happen if you get to the highest level. And then you have to be able to handle this and not be afraid of yourself, and be, well, confident in yourself. And I think that really connects to the next red flag, is, be your, like, don't be someone else.
Right.
Don't be like, oh, this player says that. No, what do you think? because, well, this player says means that you copy paste what this person says, but then you can also say, like, well, I spoke with someone and we were discussing, and I think that this might be really good. Like, if you say the I, that means that you think it. If you say this person says, it's quite far away from you. And it's like a small change, and it might be a language barrier. If you are native to a language, that might
Mm.
actually happen. But since we only have Dutch players, um, that language barrier, they are all
You
natives.
understand what
Um,
they're saying.
exactly, you understand what they're saying, and like if you are only looking at other reasons, other things around you, other people, or, well, it's because he plays this kind of play style, and it's also little bit connecting with the self-reflecting part,
Mm.
which we started with. But I think really, like, look at what other people say and make it your own. I think that's the good thing to do. And if you look at other people and copy paste it, that means there's a red flag.
Yeah, for sure. For sure, I believe that those are really good red flags to look out for. So to summarize, is being late, not self-reflective. Don't be too negative. You need to be somewhat negative to criticize maybe others within your team, but not too negative. You have to also look at those little bright moments in your gameplay as well. Understand what things you
Yeah, and
do
I'll
right.
think that don't be too negative is probably don't be only negative and don't be only positive. Like,
Yeah.
even I'll think one thing that happened during the last spring split, what we had is, like, we lost our competitive game and we were 6-0, and we lost to Amcon and we became 6-1. And we're like, what? Why did we lose? We are number one. We are the best team. We're going to conquer the world. And then the one player said and he knows I'm speaking about him, but he said, like, well, this loss was because of me. I lost this game.
Hmm.
And if you're saying I lost this game, that takes away the opportunity for other players to say, no, I lost the game. Or you really have to have this great connection. But otherwise, people are like, well, yeah, you lost the game.
Yeah.
It's all
Easy.
you.
Thank you.
Exactly. And then that means that they stop thinking about what they could have done better, or at least it might result into them not thinking about what they could have done better. So I think that not being only negative or too negative, like, you need a healthy mix of negative and positive, um, and you also need to give people space. And maybe that's a little bit new red flag, depends on what you want, Donny. But I think that giving people space to have their own, well, conclusion. I don't think
Hmm?
that's the
Yeah,
English
yeah,
word,
yeah.
like their own findings, like that's important as well. And then you can't really claim a loss. If you claim a win, you probably get laughed at by your team, but if you claim a loss, this can actually be a little bit destructive.
Yeah. Yeah, great point for sure. So in recruiting land and everything that you see, because it seems like you have a clear plan, a clear step by step process to filter out talent, etc. And I hear you doing so much things right. What are your main frustrations when looking at esports teams and that you see like, oh lordy, what
You
are you
you
doing?
really like this question, don't you? um I think, like my main frustration is just introducing players, ask them to start playing in the evening, drop them on your Discord or your TeamSpeak or whatever you use, probably Discord because TeamSpeak is for boomers, and then you start playing. I think that's probably one of the things I hate most, because that
Mm.
means that as an organization or as a coach, you don't really care about your players. It shows no interest at all. You only care about the mechanical talent of a player. And I think players feel this as well, right? They recognize this. And they're like, well, why didn't I get an introduction call? Why didn't
Mm.
I get to meet the coach? You feel like you're not special, or they
Yeah.
don't really want you.
It's a
Um,
chore. Like, okay, I've done this.
exactly. Okay, I've invited them to do a tryout. But it's so much more. So if I would just pinpoint one thing, which I completely hate, it's this. And then I think the second thing that I completely dislike if it goes to scouting is, um well, not being honest with your players. So saying like, well, these players have already said they want to try out even before they want to try out. And then you're like, oh, sadly they couldn't try out, but then this person already committed, which gives them false hope, false indications as well. It's just unfair. And
Mm,
even during the tryouts, don't say to a player who isn't is most likely not going to make it that he's doing great. No, say like, well, I think the odds aren't that good. Just to be honest, and just
yeah.
let them know what is actually happening and what they can still do to get a spot in the team, and don't give them false hope, because sometimes players are like, well, I still have this tryout and it's really promising, and
Yeah.
then they get denied, and then they're like, huh, how is it possible that I get denied? I don't understand it. And the argument that they gave, I completely can't understand it. And then of course there's a part where it's the player. It might, of course, be the player who just doesn't want to understand it. But I think it's a really fine line where you just did a bad management expectations for the player, which means
Mm,
they were completely surprised and had their hopes up and then were disappointed. But this disappointment goes up to dislike of the organization, of the coach, which means that there's so much more negative instead of just, well, those are small, but you might be able to please work on this. Please be able to do a little bit more this, communicate
right.
more. Um, so teams who don't really have this honest perspective, and give false hope to players, it's something like I really really hate it. Like always, I think management expectations probably
Just be
it
honest,
just be honest.
organization.
Like, well, it's not that hard, and it is probably hard because it's sometimes tough to be honest, but people understand it, and most of the time people feel it all as well. Like
Yeah.
they already know, like, well, it isn't going that good, and then if you're saying like, wow, really good, I'm really
Yeah.
happy
Don't
about
leave them
today.
in a twilight zone.
Exactly. So I
Yeah.
think these 2 pointers are probably the most important things that I really dislike, and I hope people who listen to this podcast are like, well, let's not do that. Like, oh, I
Yeah.
did this wrong, and that's completely fine. Everybody make mistakes, and that's fine as long as you try to learn from your mistakes.
Yeah. For sure. For sure. Good points on frustration, because those points, that is what I see in many, many teams as well around me, and how they behave in scouting and recruitment environment. And it's just amateur. Like, if we want to develop, we have to do better stuff. They
Exactly,
deserve
and
better, and you as an organization and as a coach deserve way better. So, is there one thing that you want to tell all the esports coaches? Um, because we're slowly moving to the end of this podcast in terms of time. Is there one thing that you still want to spill out and feel like, okay, this is my golden nugget that I want to leave the audience with in terms of scouting and recruitment?
I think it's an interesting one where I'd probably say that, um, don't always trust your gut feeling. People
Hmm.
sometimes can completely surprise you, and sometimes people, I think, this is a great example, and I don't think he will listen to this podcast, so that's great. So back in the day, we had this lineup in League of Legends with Bruder, with Vipo, famous for Fnatic, of course, and then Photon, who played in Challenger Series before, so you could go up to LCS,
Hmm.
and then Kane as well, and another player that nobody knows. But like for Bruder, he was multiple seasons #1 challenger, but he was really toxic online, and his
Hmm.
image was really toxic. But then you start chatting with this guy, and you're like, "Whoa, this is actually interesting." But my gut feeling at first was like, "Well, he's too toxic. This might not work." Um, and he completely surprised me. So give people the opportunity to surprise you,
Hmm. Be
and
open for surprise.
exactly, be open for surprise. And if it's as expected, which it is the majority of time, I think 9 out of 10 times, it's completely fine because it's similar to what you expected. But like 10% of the times or even more, which is quite a lot, you will get surprised. And that gives you a great opportunity. And if we look at probably the best scouts, the best players you can scout, they are these kind of players
Yeah.
where you have a certain expectation and then they do something and you're like, whoa, this is perfect. And of course, other players who don't have this are also talented, but like these kind of players that really surprise you have so much more which you don't know and which you don't see online because they have like this shield in front of them, even on social media, even in game. But if you get through and really poke them, then you can get so much more. So don't be blindsided on intel from other people. Just talk to
Yeah.
someone. Just start a conversation and
Do the
look for
work.
exactly do the work and look further than assumptions, because assumptions are the mother of all fuck ups.
Yeah, for sure. Amen. Hallelujah. So, in this podcast series, we also weave in some questions from previous episodes and
Yeah.
also upcoming episodes. So, in the last episode, number 5, Coach Nikolai Hazel Larson, he asked a question for you. And he asked the question, why are we seeing no substitutes or bigger rosters for teams and see them used? Why is that,
Yeah,
Floris?
so I think it's an interesting one. Um, and I always was like, well, you can use an academy team, and you should actively use it for your team. And then I was to this webinar from Peter Dunn, I think,
Mm,
when he just joined Evil Genius. Um,
couple of months ago, yeah.
yeah, and he was like, well, I really dislike using academy teams in this kind of context, or let them play against their own team, because the same reason I really dislike doing tryouts against each other is because you have this wrong mindset. You have this mindset where you compete with someone. So I think it's really hard to compare players because you don't really want to let them play against each other in house. So it means that you don't really know if it's going to fit. So it's a gamble. And if you replace your main spot player for your substitute spot player, then that means you've lost faith in the main player. And if the main player doesn't acknowledge your vision and doesn't agree with your take, that means that they'll get demotivated. So I think most of the time it's not being able to explain the player why you want to do this and let them understand and agree with it. Because if you are going to move in your substitute and your main player doesn't agree and he gets moved to the substitute, what happens after the substitute fails or can't handle the pressure? And then what are you going to do? Are you going to put in the main player again? This one won't be a good journey because he never agreed with you. And
How do
that
you hold it
means,
against traditional sports where you have sports teams, 11 football players in the field, and the bench is full with substitute players?
yeah,
Even though
so
that's a physical thing, but you have basketball and
exactly.
isn't the internal competition somewhat healthy as well? So
Uh,
they want to
yeah,
fight for their spot and
I think it is really healthy, and I think we should have this in the near future. But I think currently, even if I look at like LCS, for example, in America, and I don't know enough about the LEC internal structures, but I
hmm,
think like if you have a full team, so 5 main and 5 academy players, then it's really tough. If you have like 5 main players and 1 or 2 substitutes, then most of the time the main player already agreed to have a substitute for his or her role, which then means they're already open for the substitution,
hmm.
which then means you won't have this conflict. But if it's a, like an, if we look at BTXL, for example, right? So they moved in Advien and Marcoon, obviously because it's 2 Dutch players, but at the same time they moved out Danik and the other guy, Dan.
Yeah, also starting
Um,
with a D. That's what I was
Yeah,
saying.
exactly. And it completely depends on how they've done this. So if they did it with the, well, currently we are going to test them. And I saw a short video about them explaining the situation. They said like, well, we've already done multiple months of checking how all small teams work and who we can
Hmm.
swap, which means that everybody understands what's going to happen. And that's already management expectation as well. But most of the times when you need to sub someone in, it's because you're not going that good. And then that means that you need to get achievements, but getting achievements uh, with swapping someone can help if you completely swap him and then the substitute works. But if it's like the full squad, 5 academy players, for example, and you just pick someone and move them up, that will probably ruin 2 teams. It might ruin the main team, or it might help them, but then it might ruin the academy team because they get the worst player. So
Hmm.
I think
Understood.
having just like 1 or 2 substitutes might even be better than a full team in the current atmosphere. I think in the future, and that's something I want as well. Um, it will work as long as everybody knows what to expect, and that's
Hmm.
something that I still don't know enough about to really say like, well, um, this is the reason why X or I. I think this is something I still have to experience in my adventure.
Yeah, exactly. I'm curious what so Nikolai, if you're watching this and this answer of your question, if that is an answer that you also agree with. I believe there could be different sides of the story depending on the context, and you're looking at the short term, and
For
there's
sure,
a
yeah.
long term as well. So
I
be
think
sure to leave a reaction to Floris as well, so
exactly.
to help each other.
I think that like one great example is Bripo, who went in-house sub for Fnatic during the time that Soa still played top lane over there. And Soa's agreed on him being a sub, and they like practice with each other, and they could eventually from there on like improve. And then Soa sadly had to stop playing during that time, and then Bripo could fit his spot, but it already worked because it was like a team, right? And Soa was open to move him in as a sub to a main. So I think these kind of things and perspectives really help for a team. And I think we should have a structure, like you said, where you just have like 10 players who can sub in and sub out, but still I think it's really tough. Um, and an additional thing to compare it to sports is how much do players on the soccer field communicate with each other.
True, it's different.
It's really different.
Yeah, you can compare something, but in general, it's like total different.
Exactly. And I think that esports, we always talk with each other. And speaking with each other is so fundamental for performance. So I think this also really makes it a little harder.
True,
That's the
true.
final note
Yeah, and
for the question.
the final, yeah, yeah, great stuff. So you always also have the opportunity to ask a question towards the next guest, and the next guest will be the next guests because it will be 2 people. It will be Colwyn Darkside King and Anthony Psycho Vicente. So they are coaches at Pro Guides,
Yeah,
and
cool.
in the next episode we will talk about monetization or as a coach on pro guides and what to look out for and to get returning customers. So that's a way different take as well. What kind of question do you have perhaps for them?
Yeah, so I don't really care about them. I'm not joking. But I'm really curious about like I mainly coach the top players, and I
Yeah.
don't really coach the middle of the pack. So if we look at League of Legends or whatever game, because most games currently use gold and similar ratings, how do you make sure that if you coach someone from gold, that you don't use too complex theories or too complex examples, and how do you make sure that it's not too easy because you have such a variety between level of your players? That means that you might use the wrong examples
Mm,
that they might not
yes.
understand. So I'm really curious about this.
Yeah, good question. So, how to coach? I will write it down, of course. How to coach on different levels.
Yeah, and how to make sure that it's not too easy but not too complex either. But it's just like the same level. What do you do? Like, do you start, for example, a conversation before you start coaching? Do you
Yeah.
do a background check? Like, what kind of steps do you
Yeah,
make?
for sure. Great question. I believe they either one of them or both they can answer it. So
I hope so. If
stay
they can't,
tuned.
I'm really disappointed.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I hope so that they can. I have a good feeling that they will. So they are with 2 already. So there's almost no excuse that it won't be answered.
Exactly.
So we're looking forward to that and towards the next episode. So if older coaches, players have more questions to reach out to you about recruiting, how to present themselves, and maybe get more advice or tips, or just to get in touch with you with anything that you do, or to help out, because that is your staple thing, helping others out within
Exactly, the
esports.
thing I like.
So, how can I reach you with social media?
Yeah, probably at Lol Escapist on Twitter.
Mhm.
Or LinkedIn, Floris Buurman.
All right.
I
I
think that would
will.
probably work best.
Perfect. So I'll be sure to drop it into the description below of this YouTube video, or in the description of the podcast, wherever
Yeah,
you're listening or
perfect.
finding it here. So they are sure to find you.
Yeah,
So
and as you mentioned, feel free to reach out. And if I can't help you, I might know someone who can. I think that's always the best approach.
that's how I started off with you.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
he
So
didn't disappoint me. So if you got any questions, be sure 100% to reach out. He is the guy, 100%. So thank you so much, Floris, for spending some time with me and providing your insights into scouting and recruiting, and the red flags and the to dos and not to dos and all the things in between. It was very fruitful for many, as well as for organizations. So if you're listening to this, spread the word if you're going through a new recruiting and scouting cycle, and just spread the word with your friends and other organizations. I believe it's very valuable in that sense. So thank you once again, Floris.
no problem. And yeah, I really enjoyed it. I love chatting about these kind of things, like esports in general, and I always do what I love. So that's perfect. And yeah, if you have any questions related to the podcast or not related to the podcast, feel free to drop them. And I'm actually, Donny, I'm really curious what kind of points people disagree on and why.
So
So
looking for discussion and
exactly,
get some turbulence, get some friction, and movement
exactly.
is
Yeah,
movement
because
forward, right?
yeah, exactly. We all want to improve, right? And that's the mindset. As long as that's the mindset, it's good.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And that is it, guys. Episode number 6 of the Next Level Esports Podcast, the number one podcast for esports coaches and team development to help you and your team reach the next level by getting the people side of esports right. Let us know in the comments what you think of this episode, and as well, smash that like, share, and subscribe button. If you know anyone that might find this podcast valuable or interesting, let them know, because we are here to provide as much value for as much people as we can, and you can help us to do so. If you want more information or things to learn about esports coaching and team development, you can go to the Next Level Esports Discord, or go to the Next Level Esports YouTube channel for more content. Find us as well on Twitter at next_L_esports. And once again, let us know what you think of this episode. Thank you so much once again, Floris, as a guest on this podcast. And for anyone that is listening, I hope that you are also tuned in for the next episode, where we will take a closer look at coaching for pro guys and how to monetize your coaching skills, and what we can learn from that perspective of coaching. Thank you all so much for listening, and as always, bye bye.
Bye bye.